Thank you, Madam President. Colleagues, I rise to present SCR 48 that recognizes a day of remembrance on the 55th anniversary of the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King. You all might remember that we were going to take this up last week, but it is ironic that as we were celebrating this great loss of life, we had a gunman, one of our Sikh brothers, driving through this city, shooting up hospitals and neighborhoods with a threat of coming to the Capitol, and we had to postpone this event. And so it's special that we are here today, and I think it is an example of how we will not be deterred, we will not be moved, we will not be distracted from the pathway of justice. But today is a day to remember Dr. King's legacy of leading a revolutionary movement that made a difference in the lives of all Americans. What is significant about the period leading up to Dr. King's untimely and tragic death was the enlightened transition he was pursuing within the civil and human rights movement. He evolved from fighting for the poor people's, he evolved to fighting for the Poor People's Campaign, fighting for workers' rights and economic justice. Dr. King was assassinated on April 4th, 1968, while standing on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, Tennessee. He was visiting Memphis to support Black sanitation workers who were on strike, demanding safer working conditions and better pay. So Dr. King didn't die while fighting to integrate schools or lunch counters. He died at a time fighting for the rights of all workers to live with dignity and respect. He believed that all work had dignity, whether you were a domestic worker, a day laborer, or a doctor, and that you can turn a bad job into a good job. You can ensure that all workers live with dignity. In his final book, Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community, and the Pro Tem gave each of us that book to celebrate Dr. King's birthday this year. This was published just a year before his death, and Dr. King discussed the failings of capitalism and his broader movement of uplifting both racial and economic equality. He believed that a multiracial working class movement was the way to create true equality in our nation. In his book, he wrote that capitalism has often left a gulf between superfluous wealth and abject poverty, and has created conditions permitting necessities to be taken from the many to give luxury to the few. His book focused on the importance of improving America's jobs and creating equitable employment, not only for Black workers, but for those from underserved communities, including the difficult-to-place workers. And he believed that those workers deserve fair and quality housing and the opportunity to consume and have access to good foods and to live in a demilitarized community. He is widely known to have asked, what good was having the right to sit at a lunch counter if you can't afford to buy a hamburger? And he exposed our nation's connections between racism and economic exploitation and how to lead the poor, the disenfranchised communities, particularly communities of color. Dr. King was, in fact, a revolutionary. The image that we celebrate today of Dr. King as being a peace-loving and affable person that everyone respected. He was considered by the FBI at the time as the most dangerous Negro in America. But he courageously continued to speak out against racism and commercial greed, and he stood up for economic justice and corporate responsibility and citizenship until his last breath. As we forever mourn the loss of Dr. King and his great vision, we can only imagine what the world could have been like had he and so many others lived. How much farther along would America, California, have been had we put into practice the humanitarian ethos that Dr. King implored us all to embrace? But instead, we're still struggling with many of the same issues and the same conditions a half a century later. Here in California, we are facing crises of unequal pay, of economic inequity, homelessness, incarceration, militarization of our communities, our police forces. Poverty continues to be a critical issue in our state, one that has undermined the progress that we've made because far too many families are living at or below the poverty line. That's why I've introduced a bill package that looks at economic equality, that talks about protecting the most vulnerable workers. SB 16 is about making sure that we empower every city across our state to enforce civil rights protections, particularly around housing and employment for all. I've introduced bills around anti-retaliation to make sure that workers who are and experience civil rights violations, that they're protected from being fired and bullied. And I'm working with so many coalitions, as are you, to ensure that displaced workers, workers who are laid off, have the protection that they need to be able to support themselves, their families, and our communities. We all can do our part to help ensure that Dr. King's vision of an equitable economy is realized. This day of remembrance is a day of action for all of us to support the creation of quality jobs and equitable economy, and that our vote and our voices are heard and preserved to continue this tradition until these evils in our society are finally put to rest. I want to thank those who are in the gallery today who came last week to celebrate with us, for coming back this week, particularly Dr. Reverend Anderson and other members of the Day of Remembrance Coalition 2023. Thank you.